Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 291, Recipe for Disaster. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
Lex, what is going on with our theme music that's playing here? It sounds a little different from the way it usually sounds. Can you explain that before we get started?
I can. So first off, a happy Shemitah to everyone. A happy beginning of the sabbatical year that we've been talking about. That's what this song is connecting to. For the first time since the launch of Judaism Unbound, we have altered our theme song. But that alteration is temporary in a sense, but it's kind of long-term temporary. It will be our theme song for the entire Shemitah year. And it's only altered in a few subtle ways that you can listen back and hear compared to other episodes. But basically, one note in the scale for various parts of this theme song has been elevated half a step because we want this year to be elevated, right? But it's also been, for the music theory nerds out there, it's been shifted to the vibe of a major seventh chord because the Shemitah year is a seventh year in the cycle, and it is a major observance. So I sort of played around with the song to have it vibe with that, but mostly I wanted to have the song sound different. I wanted to just have a reminder each week of this show that this year is different, and the theme song is a way to get at that by having it sound a little different. And so you'll be listening and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's right, this song sounds a little different than it has in the past. That's because it's the Shemitah year. And so then hopefully, especially because we're going to be having different episodes where we talk about the Shemitah year, you will be able to channel that little difference into different practices, actions, ideas in your Jewish life and experimentation. So that's what's going on.
So before we start today's episode, just a couple of quick notes. Number one, we hope you had a very happy Jewish New Year. And one thing about the high holidays is there is a sort of tradition that Jewish organizations tend to ask for a Yom Kippur appeal. We're going to add our voice to that just a little bit and just say, please consider at this time of year, if Judaism Unbound has been a meaningful part of your past year, we want to leave it up to you to consider what a meaningful donation would be for you and what you think what we do is worth to you. But if it's worth a substantial amount, we hope you'll really take this opportunity to contribute that certain amount. And the way to do that is to go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate. And while you're there, you should check out our newest project, the Unyeshiva, which you can just get to by going back to the Judaism Unbound homepage and clicking on Unyeshiva. And it'll take you to this page about this new digitally driven educational institution that we're setting up that's going to include live classes. Lex and I are both teaching a live class in just a few weeks, so you can sign up for that. And there's also all kinds of playlists of our material that we've created on Judaism Unbound, on Jewish Live, and in other ways that we're trying to put together into different topics that are sort of like courses that are asynchronous, meaning you can listen to them anytime. So again, please consider making a donation to Judaism Unbound at this time of year, and also take a look around at the Unyeshiva and consider whether that would be something fun for you to do in the next semester. So now let's jump into our episode. Our guest today is a returning guest. We actually talked to her just a few months ago, Aimee Lucido. And today we are talking about her new book, Recipe for Disaster. Recipe for Disaster is going to be officially released in just a few days after this episode debuts. It's a novel written for middle grade readers, but I read it and I loved it. And I promise you, everybody of every age, you will love it. It's a lot of fun, and it's also really meaningful and important and thought-provoking. And we think it's actually one of the most important books that we have read this year for sure, maybe during the time of this podcast, maybe ever. So Recipe for Disaster is a novel whose themes tie directly to the themes of this podcast, including Judaism outside the walls of official institutions, interfaith relationships, what we're talking about these weeks, the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, as well as perceptions about what it means to be Jewish enough, The book is what's termed a hybrid novel, which means that it's a novel, but it also intersperses between the chapters, between some of the passages, recipes, actual food recipes you could cook along with this book. And they're not random insertions, but they're part of what moves the plot itself forward. And because we think it's so important, we've actually created a little page on the Judaism Unbound website specifically devoted to this book. By the way, I promise you, we don't get any financial kickback from this. This is only because we think it's so great and important. That website is www.judaismunbound.com/recipe. And you can find links there to purchase the book. You can sign up to be part of digital conversations discussing the themes of the book. And also, you can find there, and you can also find in the show notes to today's episode, a link to what Aimee Lucido is calling her book mitzvah. If you're excited about attending something like a book mitzvah, who knows what that is? I'm really excited to find out. So just a few more words of introduction for today's guest. Aimee Lucido is the author of Recipe for Disaster. She is also the author of a book called Aimee in the Key of Code, which is a story about a girl who's not sure if she's more musician or computer scientist. And maybe there's an autobiographical element to that novel because Aimee Lucido has a background in computer science, and she also does a really cool thing. She is a crossword puzzle maker, and she recently had a puzzle in the New York Times Sunday magazine. And I think that's sort of like the highlight of crossword puzzle making. And I do want to say parenthetically in my own praise that I solved that puzzle, and it was a really good one. She has also published crossword puzzles at The New Yorker, the Crosswords with Friends app, and all kinds of other places. But we are really excited about the fact that Aimee Lucido has turned her novelistic attention to questions of Jewish identity and Jewish life. And so, Aimee Lucido, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to talk to you again.
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited to be back here.
Where I wanted to start was asking you how one starts to put together a book like this. I mean, it's one of those cases where, I just sort of wonder, for example, is a book completely plotted out in advance, or is it something that sort of comes along? And then how do you kind of make sure that the parts of them are talking to each other? Because there were certain things that happened in the book that I was like, oh, I didn't see that one coming. But in retrospect, it was coming all along.
I feel like I almost started this book backwards in a way. I started writing it because I was coming off of my first book, which Aimee in the Key of Code, which combines Java code and poetry. And so I was thinking I wanted to do something kind of similar for my second book, but with a different form of poetry. And so I decided on recipes. And when I was sort of brainstorming ideas that I associate with food and recipes, I thought about my family. I thought about particularly my Jewish family. And when you're talking about 12, 13-year-old kids in a Jewish family, they're thinking about their bat mitzvah, maybe. And so actually the very first version of this book, I would say, is the total opposite of what it is now, because the story now is a book about a girl who decides she wants a bat mitzvah. Originally, the first 6 months I was working on this book, it was the opposite. A girl who comes from a more traditionally religious family who does not want a bat mitzvah. And I found that I was completely incapable of writing that because that's not my story. That's not my family. I have no experience with that. And every step of the way, I just didn't know what to write next. And it wasn't until I had the idea to reverse it that the story came much more easily to me.
Talk to us about your own connections to Jewishness, your own struggles, challenges with Judaism, with Jewish institutions. I think that for the book that resulted, that set of conversations is really important. You mentioned, you wrote the book backwards because it was initially the opposite. I'm going to ask a question sort of backwards because one of the last things in your book is an author's note that I found to be one of the most profound documents on Jewish identity and experience that I've read in a really long time. And people, please read the whole book. But if there's one piece you read of this book, the author's note is not a bad place to start. What led you not just to, write a book about this bat mitzvah experience, but to write one that is so thoroughly anchored in questions of, who's Jewish enough, who gets to call themselves a Jew, who doesn't, who's allowed actually to not call themselves a Jew? That comes in too. How do these questions flow through you? What's your story and connection to those?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my life, especially as a kid and even through adulthood, not knowing if I counted as Jewish. My background is that my mom was raised Jewish, but doesn't really practice much today. My dad was raised Catholic and doesn't really practice much today. I think if you asked my dad if he was Catholic, he would say no. If you asked my mom if she was Jewish, she would say yes. But I don't know if she would have said that maybe 20 years ago. And so all this sort of meant that my cultural and religious upbringing was a bit hodgepodge. Like we celebrated Christmas and Hanukkah. We celebrated Easter and Passover. And Passover was much more a family holiday. Like we would go visit my Jewish family, and, Passover would only happen if we were with them. We never really went to temple unless we were going to celebrate like a cousin's naming ceremony or going to a bat mitzvah. And like we even joked that, when I used to say oy, they would try to get me to say oy vey as a kid and like clap my hands to my face, but I would only do it with one hand. And they would say it's because she's half Jewish. This was sort of something I just never knew if I counted or not.
Are you just the oy or just the vey? This is important.
I think I was the oy, especially as I say that now as an adult. Nice. I was the oy half of the oy vey. But I really just never knew if I counted. And so when bar and bat mitzvah season started, or B mitzvah season started coming up, I was really jealous. Like I felt this connection to the party, obviously, because that was the fun part, but the ceremony too. Like I would sit and I would read the book and I would try to follow along, and I would understand enough that I felt like I was a part of it, but also not understand enough that I felt kind of distanced from it. And I would sort of fall behind in the pages. Like I would get lost at some point, but I would really try to keep up. And as I got older, when I was in college, a lot of my friends were Jewish, and I started going to, these Havurah services. And I don't actually know what Havurah means, but in this particular context, there were these very musical services that happen on Friday nights. And I always really loved them because of the music, and also because my friends were there. And then we would have like a big dinner after, and it was just like this really fun party. And I, told my parents that I was starting to go to these things, and they were like, "Why? You're not really Jewish." And I was like, "But I am, though." No one could ever agree if I was Jewish or not. And if I would, if somebody would ask me, I would say, well, like kind of like, I have one parent that's Jewish. They'd be like, well, which parent? And I would say my mom, and they'd be like, oh, okay, you're Jewish now. Like we'll allow you because of your mom, as if my, if my dad were the Jewish one, it wouldn't count. I feel like I spent so much of my life thinking about these rules around Judaism and did I count? Was I allowed to count myself? If so, why? If not, why not? And so that is really where this book came from, is like trying to dissect these questions and realizing that there aren't any clear answers.
I want to talk more about getting lost in the pages of the prayer book when you're at about mitzvah, bar mitzvah, b mitzvah. I think that's so important, because here, and it's less about that and more about like a genre of Jewish experiences. It is a Jewish experience that millions of Jews have had to get lost and fall behind in the prayer book. It is not a less Jewish experience than keeping up with the prayer book. It's an equally Jewish experience to keeping up with the prayer book. But somehow the people who get lost in the pages of the prayer book come away from that feeling that they are deficient as Jews, or sometimes they're told that, it's bad that whether they are told that they should know Hebrew or should know it better or whatever, or it's just sort of implied that that's less Jewish than somebody who's more full-throatedly participating. But the reality is, I don't any longer, for the most part, fall that far behind in prayer books. But I read that part and I was like, yeah, of course. Like that resonates with me. I know that. I know what that feels like to have somebody, racing along and sitting there feeling like what's going on right now. And I'm, of the grand scheme of Jewish experiences, I'm somebody who does spend time going to services and that kind of stuff. So I really want to shout to the rooftops that like what your book does in a lot of ways is simply by existing and telling this story and being a Jewish book. Like one could not read this and think like, oh, it's not really Jewish. You might not like it. Everything about this book is layered through Jewish experience. But like what you do is you say, feeling alienated from the service in one way or another, feeling confused, like all of those things are actually Jewish things to feel. It's not that you are falling short in what you're supposed to be doing. And look, it's not that I want everybody to feel alienated from prayer. Like that's not the takeaway here, is that like, yes, that's a Jewish thing. So everybody should feel alienated from Jewish spaces. No, what my takeaway is that sends a message to people of like, oh, here I was thinking that the way that I feel was a signal that, like, I'm not doing this thing right. But turns out there's a lot of people like me, and if we actually saw each other as partners in this Judaism project, and where our experiences, the not feeling Jewish enough was the starting point, we might be able to do some cool things.
Every single moment in that comes either directly from my experience or from, a conversation with a friend about their experience. Getting lost in a prayer book was absolutely me, and absolutely me feeling like I wasn't good at this thing. And, the funny thing about that particular example is sometimes I was getting lost in the prayer book because I was like going through and reading the poetry, or like I was, or like I wanted to like dig deeper into something. And like now I look back at that and I was like, well, that's such a Jewish thing to do. But at the time I kind of thought about it as, a failure on my part. Or sometimes I would get distracted because I was thinking about something. Like I'd be thinking about God and like, do I believe in God? And isn't it strange that I'm singing this praise to God and I don't know if I believe in it or not? And like I was doing some very deep thinking, and that's why I was getting lost. Like and there's many details in this book that I very consciously put in because I kind of wanted to showcase the breadth of Jewish experience. Like there's a moment where the family's eating bacon, and like some people have pointed that out as a moment that like maybe I should get rid of that. Like maybe that's something that people won't like when they read it. But I put it in very intentionally because I am a Jew that eats bacon, and I wanted people who are also Jews that eat bacon to read that and feel seen. Or there's a moment where there's a scene where they're celebrating Christmas, and there's like a fight over whether they should like put a menorah in the window. And it's not like it's a very small part of the book, but I wanted it there because I know lots of Jews who like know more Hebrew than I do, and who go to services more often than I do, who also celebrate Christmas. And so I very intentionally put a lot of these details in because I wanted people who have had those experiences and have viewed them as reasons to not consider themselves Jewish to realize, this is just as valid as anything else.
Yeah, it's interesting that you picked up on this question that I was just going to ask Lex for clarification, which is when you say people getting lost in the prayer book, do you mean they're lost because they've lost the page and they don't know where they are? Or do you mean they got lost because they got lost inside of it and they found something interesting and they, were thinking about it? And, there are two different ways of getting lost. And I'm sure the answer is yes, both. But like, it was really interesting to hear you pick up on.
You're very generous. I really meant just the not interesting one, like getting lost, falling behind. But like, you both went way more profound than me. I don't want to take credit because, you both did better things than I meant initially.
Well, because like, I both want to affirm what I think you were saying, Lex, which is that to just get lost because you don't speak Hebrew and you didn't know these prayers and you didn't catch up, like that's a totally legitimate and important kind of Jewish experience. And I would call it a normative Jewish experience because it's actually the normal thing that happens to most people. Most people are not caught up. And, so how is it like abnormal and bad to be, the main kind of experience? But I want to put out there that this other variant of it that says I got lost because I got hooked on something, something really got me thinking, and maybe thinking about things that the rabbi wouldn't have been happy to know that I'm thinking about, but nevertheless kind of got me thinking. Like, that is talked about as a kind of a negative thing. Like, you didn't catch up, you weren't with the service, as opposed to like, you could say like, that's what the whole service is about. Like if you like, I almost feel like, I don't know if he would actually say this, but I've been reading a biography of the Chabad Rebbe, and I almost feel like it's the kind of thing that he would say, like if you just found one thing in the whole service that really caught your attention, that was the point of the service. And we, a bunch of months ago, we had this series about the Torah. One of the things that we were talking about was this idea that modern writings of various kinds, instead of thinking about them as midrash or as commentaries or whatever, like, what if we thought about them as Torah? And with this book in particular, I was thinking about, like, without giving away too much, like, there's actually a new, or you could argue that there's a new approach to what a bar mitzvah would be that is described in this book, or that ultimately it's not quite where you go explicitly, but you could imagine somebody reading this book and saying, oh, you just presented a much better way to do this ritual at this particular time. And I can imagine, like, somebody says, and where did you get this ritual? It's like, oh, well, of course, the book of Recipe for Disaster is all about the invention of this ritual. It's why I think that this book is not just a kid's book. It's like, it's doing something that I don't think a lot of Jewish literature that's out there is doing, which is it's really kind of offering a particular way to be Jewish that fits the life experience of a lot of Jews. And it actually kind of offers the whole path to how to get there. And it just makes me sort of wish that there was more like it out there. Like I keep coming back to this question of like, how conscious is this kind of thing for an author? And the reason is because if it is conscious, then my question is like, how can other people go about trying to do something analogous? And if it's not conscious, I guess I have the same question. Like, how do you free yourself to kind of go on this exploration? And what are some of the mechanics of doing it so that you ultimately feel comfortable writing a book about it at the end, as opposed to a lot of people in your situation who would have said, what do I know enough about to write a Jewish book? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something where I'm an expert.
The part that's the most conscious for me is I like to write books about things that I don't have an answer to. If I know the answer to something, I don't even want to read a book about it. Like why would I want to spend a whole several years writing about it? I mean, the story is very much my story. Like, it's not like they say, write what you know. Like, I very much did that with this. But at the same time, I did so much research for this book because I didn't know so much. Like, I didn't speak any Hebrew. I didn't know much about Torah. I still don't really even have like the best idea of all the parts that go into like a traditional bar mitzvah. And like, I'm not like a mystical woo-woo person, but I can become very spiritual when it comes to the art of writing. And because it sometimes just feels like you're a conduit. I don't really know what dowsing is. Dowsing is the thing where you have like a stick and you're like looking for water. And I kind of imagine, I don't really know the science behind it, but I imagine that there's some kind of like instinct where you know if you're getting closer or further away. And that sort of feels like what writing feels like to me, where like there's something else going on. My job is just to have an ear to listen for when things are closer or further. As you get closer and closer, like you hear like a imaginary bell or something. But like I can get like very woo-woo about it, where it doesn't feel like I'm doing it. It feels like it's happening. And I just sort of have to like trust that it's going to come through me in some way.
So somebody I know who is a rabbi, I saw them post a picture, which was them with a sign that said, "Come get free advice from the rabbi." And which is, nice thing, like conversation starter with people in the community that this person serves. And it really got me thinking, because what would happen if we had a bunch of rabbis on the opposite side of that, approaching regular Jews, holding their signs saying, "Ask the regular Jew for advice"? I actually think we need that, where people who have positions of authority, positions of communal leadership in Jewish life, like I think we need that as much as we need the other. And the reason I say that is because I think if people were to ask an everyday Jew to like give a long form advice to leaders, like what kinds of things should you be thinking about as a Jewish leader, I think an end product that looks like your book would be a pretty good answer. Your book feels like what somebody who is an expert in outsider Jewish experience. Like I want to paint you as an expert. I don't want to just like talk about you as, oh, you're somebody who's not a rabbi, not an insider. Like you are an expert. You have a deep well of experiences, a lifetime of experiences in being a Jew with a certain set of Jewish moments where you have not felt most central in whether we call it Judaism or Jewish spaces or whatever. That is a huge expertise. And, this is the classic book talk question where people ask some form of like, if you were speaking to writers out there that are looking to write a book, what would you say to them? Like, this is not that broad. Like, but if there's people listening to our podcast, which I desperately hope there are and think there are, who are sitting there like, oh, I do feel spoken to when we're talking about the set of people that are Jews who specifically have not felt included, and the idea that I have a responsibility as an outsider to shape Judaism through a book or through creating some community is exciting. Like, what would you say those people might do?
I think there's like a couple of directions that this advice can go. Like, I think the first, and this is something I hope people take away from the book itself, stop believing that you like don't count. the biggest limitation to like getting books out there or pieces of art out there, or even just conversations about, broadening the definition of Jewish, people sometimes will self-censor because they don't necessarily think that they have the right to have thoughts about it because they don't think that they're Jewish enough. When in reality, what you said is exactly right. Like, these people are experts in not feeling Jewish enough. And I think beyond that, once someone has sort of given themselves that permission and they want to create art about it, to do it. Like, I wish I had like something more profound than just like actually go to your computer and start typing in an empty Word document. Or, buy paint and put paint on a canvas. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is like, if you have the idea, you have to like first give yourself permission to do it, and then you need to do it. We talked about this a little bit on the podcast last time, but there's a tremendous power that we have when we create art for kids in particular, because I know my Jewish identity was shaped in many ways by the books I read, which was at the time pretty much exclusively Holocaust literature. But I devoured that because I needed that. The bigger breadth of art that we can create specifically for kids, we're doing a lot of work, like very heavy lifting, to get kids to believe that their experiences are legitimate.
One of the things that struck me when I was reading this book is that I was like, oh, great. Now we have another book that we can give out for bar mitzvahs, because we have a few books that we typically give a kid, and so now we've got another one for that list. But I was like, but that's too limited. Like, this isn't a book that only kids should be reading. This is a book that I think, honestly, like I have no financial stake in this book, nor are we like old friends. I have nothing at stake here. I really feel like, of all the books that we've talked about on Judaism Unbound over the years, like, I feel like this is the one that I would say every Judaism Unbound listener should read and should have, because it really, like, I don't know of that many books that really capture this kind of orientation. But I'm curious if maybe there are things that you've read that have influenced you or helped you that we could also talk about.
So I don't actually read a ton of adult books. I'm starting to read a few more now, but most of the books I read these days are written for kids. And most of the Jewish books that I've read in my life, I read when I was pretty young, and they were about the Holocaust. And obviously that is growing, thank goodness. Like, I feel like over time, so much of my Jewish education has come from like conversations with other Jewish writers in a lot of ways, and learning about the Jewish canon that I didn't know existed, or even just having conversations about the abundance of books about the holidays and how, at some point that gets a little tiresome. I mean, like, I love so many books about the Jewish holidays, but like, I didn't want to write about that because I just felt like I didn't have anything to add to that conversation.
So there's a bunch of issues that we've talked about on this show over the years that I think your book shines a light on in really important ways. And I'd love to just like talk about some of those meta issues, not just through your book, but just hear from you as the author of it. And so a few times in your book, but especially in one particularly poignant scene, there is a really in-depth back and forth around who is a Jew, what is a Jew. And, I've watched a lot of Jewish films. I've read a lot of Jewish books, and many of them have even in implicit ways provided their commentaries on what Jewishness is. This was like really right in front of you for, sixth graders and for adults, a conversation about like, what is Judaism, religion, people, who's a Jew? Is it through, like, how do we define this? It was really, I'm going to say intense, but it wasn't intense in an overwhelming way. It was intense in a thought-provoking way. But so I'd love to, just putting aside the specifics of that scene, like, who's a Jew? What's Judaism? Like, how, and maybe the frame is like, how did you grow up thinking you might have been supposed to answer that question? And how now might you answer that question?
So my answer of what is a Jew is I have absolutely no idea. Like I wrote this entire book, and like I still really don't know. And I guess like if I had to say an answer, it would be you're Jewish if you feel Jewish. But I also think in a lot of ways we don't get a choice. For some people, it's more of a choice, and some people it's less of a choice. But I think for everyone, it's somewhat of a choice. I guess so much of my life, I would hear these rules about what it meant to be Jewish. And like the one that I kind of heard the most often because my mom is Jewish was, if your mom is Jewish, you're Jewish. And like that rule never really made much sense to me because, I mean, first of all, why my mom and not my dad? Like I was just as much related to my dad as I was my mom. And yes, it seemed to really matter to people that it was my mom that was the Jewish one. And I know now sort of the history behind that. And it's because historically who the mother of a child was something that you could prove. This notion is like incredibly outdated. Like if you think of all the different ways that, parentage can be defined, and it's just something that like, it never made sense to me before, but the more I think about it, the less sense it makes. There's also this big question about, is Judaism a religion or is it a culture? And it's sort of both, and it's sort of in between. And I've never considered myself a religious person, so it feels very weird to claim a religion as my own. But sort of the joke I was making over the weekend was I just saw Fiddler on the Roof for the first time. And I've never seen this movie before, but I knew every character. I knew every song. I knew like the broad strokes of the plot. And my mom was like, "Oh, you've definitely seen it before." And I was like, "No, I'm sure I haven't." Like none of the images are familiar to me, but like I know Topol. And like this is something that was like had somehow seeped into my consciousness, and I don't know how. I spent so much of my life trying to figure this question out of like, what makes me Jewish? Why am I Jewish? Am I even Jewish? And I had so many conversations with so many people over the course of writing this book. And so many people, that I was having this conversation with weren't sure themselves. And actually the character of V is in some ways inspired by a friend that I met when I went on Birthright when I was 26, which now I don't know if I would do that again, but I did. And one of the people that I met on this trip, she was like, "Well, I kind of snuck in, like I'm not really Jewish." And I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Well, my mom, I mean, she's not really my mom. My birth mom died when I was really young, but my stepmom is Jewish, but I call her my mom." And I was like, "Why would you think that doesn't count?"
There was a really interesting moment in the book. I mean, for me, it was the most powerful moment in the book that relates to this. And what's interesting about it, I'm trying to describe it without too many spoilers, is that one character hurts another character's feelings by calling their Judaism into question. But what's interesting is that the person who hurts is not like a rabbi, and there are rabbis in the book. It's not somebody who's, Orthodox or somebody who's like an authority figure in Judaism. It's actually in some ways one of the least authoritative people that hurts another person by kind of parroting something that she has heard from others and just assumes is true, doesn't agree with it, doesn't like it. I mean, it's not like they're advocating this principle, but they're just saying, but wait, this is what I thought Judaism is. And somebody who has like a very different approach to it is very hurt by that. And that struck me so hard because like that struck me as like, that is the typical story. Like people think that, and I think that I often probably think this and articulate it, and, mea culpa for that the finger to be pointed at who is causing the alienation is the more religious people or the people more in authority. But really, it's all of us. And, I felt like that scene called my attention to that in a really powerful way. And the question, though, for you as an author and also as just a person is, what does a Jewish world look like in which we avoid doing that? How do you have a concept like being Jewish that is by definition going to have definitions, and yet at the same time make it such that people aren't, accidentally putting their foot in their mouth and harming other people, not even realizing it just because they're just assuming that it's a certain way.
When we don't feel secure in our own Judaism, we start to look for kind of these really binary definitions of like, are we or aren't we? And I think sort of matrilineal Judaism is something that I clung to, was like, oh, my mom's Jewish, I'm Jewish. Bing, bang, boom, I'm done. But I think when we have those binary definitions, that's when we can hurt people, and that's when we can alienate people. And so I think interrogating those first and foremost and figuring out why they're there, and deciding if they are actually something that we believe that is consistent with our values, that's probably the first step. This is why I'm not a speculative fiction writer. I'm not good at visualizing a world where like everything is, where we're done. But I like to think about the first steps. And I think so much of it is just like, is just interrogating like why we do the things we do and if they matter to us and if we care about them. Like I think in this past year, especially, people have really done a lot of that, where we've had to reassess a lot of traditions. And we've had to, take the salient points of these traditions and apply them to a world that didn't look like what it did, even a year and a half ago. Maybe coming out of this pandemic, we will have a broader imagination for what the world looks like in the future.
So I'd love to take another stab at a meta issue, an overarching Jewish question that plays a key role in your book, and that's food. Very different from Who is a Jew in some ways, but also very similar in the importance it has. You mentioned earlier that there was bacon in your book and that sets people off. We had a conversation with Rachel Lewis, who wrote a different book, and the fact that she had a rabbi in it who a few times a year ate chicken that was not kosher was scandalous to some of her readers. So clearly the food stuff is pushing people's buttons in a deep way. And what I take from that is, yes, food is not some, sidebar issue. It's very much central to how we build community and holiness. That's not news to you because your book folks, this isn't a spoiler. You can look at the cover. Don't judge a book by its cover, but do look at the beautiful cover of Recipe for Disaster, which has a whole slew of visible Jewish foods there for you to see. I'm not going to tell you why they're there, but basically food plays a key role here. And I'd love to hear from you, what you were sort of conveying by having food play what really feels like a sacred role, not just sort of an interesting, fun role in your book.
So I mentioned earlier that food was actually my entry point into this book. I wanted to play with recipes and poetry. And when I think of recipes, I think of family dinners, and I think of specifically the dinners that I have with my Jewish family, the big dinners that we had together, the Passovers, the latke parties, the ceremony that comes around food. And I think of the phrase bagel and lox stew, which is sometimes used as a dismissive, they're not really Jewish, they're bagels and lox stew, as in the only connection that this person has to Judaism is that they like bagels and lox, which is, considered like a New York Jew kind of food. But also what's wrong with a really strong connection to Jewish food? There's so much metaphor built into Jewish food. I mean, we have challah on Shabbat. We rip off a piece and we dip it in the salt. We fast on Yom Kippur. We eat apples and honey for Rosh Hashanah. There's so much depth in Jewish food. And if we think of Judaism as a family thing, as something we get from our family, food is so often something that's passed down throughout a family. The brisket that I make for Passover is, the same one that my mom makes. It's almost become sacred. And there's a moment, I mentioned this in the book, but I think it's really fascinating. It's just a single line in the book. But we wash our hands twice in the Passover Seder, once before the ceremony of Passover and once before the meal. And it's because the meal is just as sacred as the ceremony itself. And so food, it can be thought of as so trivial, it's just food, who cares? But there's so much meaning behind food. And ultimately, it's the way that Hannah connects to Judaism and how she connects to her grandmother, which in a lot of ways is her connection to Judaism. And actually, you said something earlier in this podcast that made me think of a book in my book that is not literally Torah, but there's a big book of recipes that Grandma Mimi, who's one of the main characters in the book, that she has. It's called The Big Book of What's Cooking. And it is a book that plays a very prominent role throughout the story. And it's the book that Hannah points to as the most important thing in her possession when she's asked that in a class. And I think in a way that book becomes her Torah. And there's been such a trend lately of foodie books in middle grade in particular. And I love foodie books, but I guess I wanted to approach mine a little bit differently because the food is not, the food's important and there's literally food throughout. But I wanted to treat it as a metaphor because that's sort of what's interesting to me is why do I connect so strongly with Jewish food? What does that mean? And how can I put that in the story?
Well, unless we think that it's only about stuff that some people would say, oh, that's not, like you were saying, that's just bagels and lox or whatever. There's also Jewish content in your book that people would those people would think is serious Jewish content. And I'm particularly interested in this whole idea of the Shemitah, because this year that we're now in is the Shemitah year, which is the 7th year in this 7-year cycle of years. And it comes from this idea of agriculture, letting the land rest for a year and then growing on the land for 6 years. But your book takes it where I think it should go, which is to understand that as a metaphor, and that there are all kinds of other things that can rest for a time, and that in that resting, potentially it gives power to re-engage with that thing. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but I'm curious about, again, the process of how you sort of discovered that particular piece of Jewish content, and then how you went about interpreting it.
I needed to assign my character a Torah portion, and it's interesting because like I'm the puppeteer here. Like I get to make this choice, and I'm restrained by some things because her birthday has to happen at a certain time, and it has to kind of fall within this band of months. Like her Torah portion was going to be in Leviticus because her birthday is in the spring, and there's even a moment where like the rabbi that she finds in the story is like, you can choose your own Torah portion. And she's like, no, that's like that doesn't count that way. But here I am choosing her Torah portion. Like I, the author, am choosing what my character does not want to choose. And I also wanted it to be kind of short because I needed it to be something that she could realistically learn in, a couple months. And I kind of wanted it to be boring because I wanted my character to have to struggle with it. Or maybe it's just some like masochism on my part that like I wanted to find something like particularly challenging to pull metaphors out of. And so I landed on Bahar, and I think Lex, you and I had a conversation about like different options for her. Like I think the process of how we chose this in some ways mirrors what a lot of kids go through when they go through their B-Mitzvah process, where they're sort of given a Torah portion, and then it's their job to like pull the meaning out of it. And I think the point is that you can find meaning in anything, and like whatever you're handed, if you want to, you can figure out a way to make it meaningful. And I'm so glad that Bahar was what we ended up landing on, because there's so much buried inside of Bahar, and like it's not obvious. Like you read this thing and it's just a list of farming laws. Like it's very dull. But like the deeper you go with it, the cooler it is. And I kind of wanted that to be my character's journey. And so, for example, one of the things that comes up is this idea of the sabbatical year, the Shemitah, which we are in right now, which is very cool and totally a coincidence. But, it's a divine coincidence, if ever there was one.
My son had a teacher in school that said there's no such thing as a coincidence. There's only a ka-incidence, because ka is one of the names of God, or a way of saying God's name. So there's only a ka-incidence.
That's very cool.
That's a stretch even for me, but I'll take it. That's great.
That's so interesting. But yeah, we decided on Bahar, and then we found all these ways to make it kind of work in the story. And so, the idea of the sabbatical year, the Shemitah comes up. There are so many things that require a rest. And one of the sort of literal examples is bread. Like if you're baking bread, it needs to rest, it needs to rise. Otherwise, you're not going to have bread. You're going to have matzah. But it's more than that. Like there are a series of relationships in the story that take a sabbatical throughout the course of the story, or in the backstory of the book. And that's something that Hannah is wrestling with over the course of the story. And it's very cool that that the book is actually, it's come out in the Shemitah.
I'm really curious what you're thinking longer term in your career as a writer you might do, because I think what I'm really hoping is that one day you'll write a adult novel, about Judaism that will be the novel that I wish that I wrote, but because I think like the novels that you're writing, which are targeted at, middle grade readers, I think that they should be read by all grades and all years. And I loved reading it. And I honestly think every Jewish adult should read it. And I'm also really interested in if you would want to write, some kind of historical fiction or, something that, I could really imagine will blow people's minds about some, hidden Jewish, Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of thing.
I mean, one of the interesting things about writing for kids is that you're writing for adults too, because, if you're writing picture books, adults are the ones literally reading the picture books to kids. If you're writing middle grade, adults are often the ones who are buying the books for middle grade kids, ages like 8 to 13, because they don't always have money of their own. They don't really have purchasing power. So you're writing to appeal to adults so that they will give these books to their kids. And I mean, also the reason that I'm writing these particular books is because It's because I think that they're interesting discussion topics. And I think that they're conversations that parents should be having with their kids or teachers with their students, or like older siblings with their younger siblings. When my friends who are not in the, kidlit world read my books, they go, I'm so surprised. I actually really liked your book, even though it's for kids. And I'm like, why are you surprised? All I read are books for kids because they're so good. I hope that people, don't consider it a guilty pleasure or anything, because I didn't write it to be a guilty pleasure. It's deep, and it's, I think kids can handle more than we maybe trust that they can.
That's something that I think is a societal problem far beyond Judaism, is that we treat things for kids as things for immature humans and things for adults as like fully formed things.
And if you write that way, then you're doing a disservice to your readers.
Yeah, and I hope we can take from this conversation and from your book, because I had a few moments reading where even I, as somebody who like actively thinks about whether we're too condescending to kids all the time, like I had some moments reading your book where I was like, oh, would a 7th grader have the vocabulary to say that word? Like, is that realistic? And then I was like, yeah, I can think to the most recent conversations I had with 7th graders, and like they actually have really deep, sophisticated thoughts about things. And I think somehow it's almost like a psychology thing where as adults, we want to think that we've been on this upward ladder in life, like that we've been improving constantly, which is like a totally fine thing to think. But it means that we have to think of the earlier versions of ourselves from elementary school, from middle school, as like not fully formed, as less than. And then we project that onto people that are currently that age. And that's like really bad. Like, I want to say that independent of any Jewish thoughts about how we do that, we could layer this on to how we treat bar mitzvah experiences and like the ways we're condescending about whether people really become adults at that point or what they're able to take on and not to take on. But like, let's really sit with what we're doing when we have that impulse as individuals, or we teach as communities that kids lit is somehow less than. I end up having this conversation every year when the Oscars happen, because routinely I think the best movie of the year is an animated movie for kids. Coco is the most recent. That was like 3 years. I don't know how many years ago that was. Like, I am furious to this day that Coco was not Best Picture, or at least in the conversation.
It's the greatest picture of all time.
Paddington 2 is the best movie of all time.
We'll have to have a conversation.
There's good Twitter discourse about this, and I'm not alone on that, by the way. That's a school of thought. Anyway, that was a rant, not a question. I do have a question that I'm really, really interested from you, because, and I hope it's okay. It's going to ask you to, in a sense, put your book on a pedestal and treat it as Torah, basically. I really do think that communities could treat your book as a kind of canonical text for new thinking about Judaism. And so my question is, like, what might they do? Like, what might they do? So like we have people who listen to this who actually have a mixture of roles in the world. Some of them are people that if you said to them, like, I think a curriculum about this with this set of characteristics would be amazing and would have an impact tomorrow, they could actually do that. And we have other people who might not be, Jewish educators or rabbis or whatever, but they could certainly put together a book club with their friends that is sort of a mission driven. Like, what would you suggest to people as almost like a mission that might be channeled through your book? Because it's not a value neutral book. It's not just, oh, I read this and it's interesting. It's a book that I read and I'm like, oh, this gives me a set of calls to action about what Judaism might look like that's different than what it currently is.
I very much wrote this to be discussed, and I really hope it gets discussed. And it has been interesting, sort of, even so far, like we've had like a couple people have read it in the last, year and a half or whatever. And I kind of love it when people don't like a character, or when they balk at the characters eating bacon, for example. And I hope that it's something that people look at and they see, okay, where has this happened to me? Like, where have I been the Hannah who is sort of considered not Jewish? And where have I been, the parents saying like, oh, you're not actually Jewish? Or like, where have we been complicit in excluding people from Judaism? Where have I been excluded from Judaism? And especially because kids are the ones who are reading this book, I hope we can kind of catch them early, maybe, and like really get them interrogating where do these beliefs come from? Where do these traditions come from? Do I care about this tradition? Do I care about this holiday? Do I care about reading Hebrew? There's so many prongs of Jewish education and sort of deciding which of them matter to them and which of them don't. And so if this was going to be something that, let's say a Hebrew school class is going to be reading this book, like, I really hope that part of the curriculum involves assessing their own traditions and assessing, like, maybe even their own bat mitzvahs or their own b mitzvahs. Like maybe there's parts of the ceremony that don't matter to them and that they don't want to do, or maybe there's something that really would matter to them that doesn't traditionally fall within the scope of a traditional b mitzvah. I hope people broaden their definitions of what b mitzvahs are, what celebrations are, what traditions are, and I hope that there's like major debate about whether that new version of the tradition counts. Like, oh no, you have to have that part in there, otherwise it isn't a bat mitzvah. Well, what about this part? Like, I just want there to be these like massive battles over this book.
More battles.
More
nice.
battles.
No, yeah, more Jewish battles. No, I hear you on that. I think that's powerful. So just to close, the last thing I wanted to ask about is your upcoming event, which really I think is a great example of what we would like people to be doing on like the ritual front, which is to say, I mean, you had this experience, you wrote a book, and something spoke to you powerfully, and then you actually for yourself put together an observance that calls to you Jewishly. And so I'd love to hear about your book mitzvah, which is a cool name first off. Happy book mitzvah.
Thank you.
But what is it, and what called you to create this event for you, marking this moment in your Jewish evolution?
So I never had a bat mitzvah growing up, and it's something I always wanted. And in some ways, it was like in my head that not having a bat mitzvah was the reason I wasn't Jewish, and I like really got that locked into my head. And even now, like it's like I know that that's not true, but I still feel that way. And writing this book, I had to do so many of the things that kids typically do when they're preparing for their b mitzvahs. Like, I mean, I learned a bit of Hebrew. I analyzed several different Torah portions. I learned to make a lot of Jewish food, which may or may not be a part of a traditional b mitzvah, but I think sometimes it maybe could be. So, but I did so much just reflection on my own Judaism and like some of the traditional Jewish canon, and it kind of felt like I was doing all this prep work for my own bat mitzvah. And so, and I think in some ways it's like, like when you're a kid and you're sort of assigned b mitzvah work, it isn't really a choice. Whereas now as an adult, I'm choosing Judaism as my life. This is who I am. And so I thought I would celebrate that. What better way to commemorate this book where I basically did all my bat mitzvah prep, and it's about non-traditional bat mitzvahs. Like, what better way to celebrate that than with my own non-traditional bat mitzvah? So I'm throwing myself a book mitzvah. It's about the book. It's not 100% about like my own coming of age or whatever. But I am doing some things in the ceremony that would be familiar to you if you are familiar with traditional b mitzvahs. So, for example, I'm looking up what my Torah portion would have been if I had my bat mitzvah when I had wanted to have my bat mitzvah at age 13. And I'm doing some analysis of that and sort of how it relates to my life and how it relates to the book. And I'm, learning some prayers that I think are meaningful, but I'm also very much adding my own twist to it because, it's about how to make the tradition match your life and not make your life match that tradition. And so I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to be this really awesome culmination of like everything that I've been working on for the last several years, everything I've cared about for the last, since I was 13 and didn't get the bat mitzvah I wanted. And I'm very excited for it.
Us too, both for that event, but also just for what your book what its reverberations will mean. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always so fun talking to you.
It was a joy for us too. Thank you, Aimee, for joining us, and thank you all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. A reminder, definitely head to judaismunbound.com/recipe, and you can purchase the book. You can sign up for conversations we're going to be having about the book. We don't have the precise dates yet, but you can put yourself on the list that we'll learn about them when they are happening. And in general, you can just explore what this amazing Recipe for Disaster is all about and how it ties to so many themes of our podcast. So definitely hit that up, judaismunbound.com/recipe. And the other thing we would love you to do is be in touch with us. And you can do that in a variety of ways. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram handles. Those are all Judaism Unbound. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com. And you can always email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. As Dan mentioned at the top, we greatly appreciate it if you are able, especially as Yom Kippur approaches, to support us with a financial donation. You can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. We hope that you will go ahead and read Recipe for Disaster, one of our very favorite Jewish books we've ever read. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.